Imagine walking into a grand ancient building, right in the center, elevated up and completely surrounded by candles. There's this golden box.
Mm-hmm.
And you are told with absolute, just unwavering certainty that inside this box is the literal, physical, living creator of the entire universe.
Which is an incredibly heavy claim.
Right. But then when the box is opened, all you see is a small, round, perfectly ordinary-looking piece of bread. I mean, usually when we think about the ultimate reality of the cosmos, we expect it to look spectacular, Galaxies, supernovas, burning bushes.
Yeah, not something you'd find in a pantry.
Exactly. But the reality we are looking at today is perfectly disguised as a snack. So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are exploring how a really simple communal ritual of bread and wine evolved into the absolute center of Western worship.
It is arguably one of the most consequential pieces of material in human history. To understand how a piece of bread became the focal point of Western theology, we are pulling from a really wide array of sources today.
We've got quite the stack.
We do. We're weaving together historical texts from the catacombs, along with the dense philosophical mechanics of medieval heavyweights, like Thomas Aquinas, and then, of course, the fiery critiques of reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin.
And some modern stuff too, right?
Yeah, we'll also be looking through the lens of modern theological analyses. So, drawing on Catholic perspectives from places like Catholic Answers and the Knights of Columbus, alongside Protestant scholarship from the Davenant Institute.
Awesome. And our goal today isn't to figure out who was, theologically right or wrong. Our mission is to unpack the profound history, the philosophical mechanics, and the intense controversies surrounding the Eucharist. We want to understand the intense logic that made both sides entirely willing to die and kill for their view of a piece of bread.
Which means we need to set some quick ground rules. Because these sources contain deeply held, politically and theologically charged beliefs from both Catholic and Protestant traditions, we will not be taking sides. Our mission is just to impartially guide you through the historical and theological ideas exactly as they are presented in the source material. We're just reporting what they said and why they said it.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we're going to understand the wars and the philosophy, we have to start with the baseline Catholic claim. How does this theology actually function from the ground up?
Well, according to our Catholic sources, you really have to view the entire universe as having been created for one highly specific purpose.
Which is what?
A love union between God and humanity. In this framework, the Eucharist is not just a symbol of that union. It is the ultimate physical culmination of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the Catholic Catechism literally refers to it as the source and summit of the Christian life. So every single other aspect of the faith, every prayer, every good work, every other sacrament is seen as either flowing out from the Eucharist or pointing directly back to it.
So instead of a timeline or like a list of rules, the cosmos functions kind of like an architectural blueprint where all the lines inevitably converge on this single point on the altar. The whole universe exists so this one union can happen. And the sources emphasize that this union operates simultaneously as both a meal and a sacrifice. I mean, how does that work?
So the dual nature is essential here. As a meal, it connects directly back to the Old Covenant. Think of the Passover lambs that the ancient Israelites ate to be freed from Egypt.
Right, the original Passover.
Exactly. In the Catholic framework, this is the New Covenant Passover, where the lamb is Christ and the freedom offered is from sin and death. But the sacrificial element is where the mechanics get incredibly specific.
Because they don't believe Jesus is dying again.
Right. The Catholic Church does not teach that the Eucharist repeats Christ's sacrifice on the cross. The historical event of the crucifixion happened once. Instead, the theology claims the Eucharist represents it.
Represents,
Yeah.
like with a hyphen.
Yes. It makes that singular historical sacrifice present again right now. Time and space are essentially collapsed. The Christ of history who died on Calvary is believed to be the exact same person present on the altar today.
That is just a massive cosmic scale. It's almost like a cosmic Russian nesting doll, The entire universe houses the church, and the church houses the Eucharist. But I have to push back here.
Go for it.
If I'm standing in the pew, looking at the altar, why does it look and taste exactly like a stale cracker and a sip of ordinary wine? I mean, if this is the literal body of the creator of the universe, why the ultimate disguise? Why hide it so perfectly?
It's a great question, and medieval theologians, particularly St. Thomas Aquinas, wrestled deeply with the psychology of that exact thing. Aquinas actually provided a dual explanation for the disguise.
Okay, what was his first reason?
First, he argued that God hides his presence to elicit a free response of faith and trust. God provides just enough light for those who seek him to find him, but respects human free will by not overwhelming the human senses with undeniable, terrifying proof.
Ah, I see. Because if God appeared in blinding, undeniable glory on the altar, belief wouldn't be a choice anymore.
Exactly. It would be compelled by sheer force of reality.
So the disguise isn't just a test of faith. It's like a psychological buffer. They believe God was actively protecting human senses from the shock of the reality.
That psychological buffer is the exact second point Aquinas makes. He noted that divine providence hides the substance because, and this is a quote, "it is not customary but horrible for men to eat human flesh."
Oh. Yeah, I mean, he has a point there.
Right. If the Eucharist actually looked, felt, and tasted like raw human tissue and blood, the natural human reaction would be intense physical revulsion. It would also subject the sacrament to endless mockery by unbelievers.
So the disguise of bread and wine is framed as an act of divine mercy.
Yes, but what's fascinating here is that Aquinas takes this a step further. He argues that in the presence of the Eucharist, your human senses, your sight, your taste, your touch, are completely deceived. You absolutely cannot trust what your eyes or taste buds are reporting to your brain.
Wait, really? Your senses are just flat out wrong.
According to him, yes. The only human sense that can be trusted in this specific moment is hearing. Because you hear and believe the words of Christ saying, "This is my body."
Man, if you genuinely believe you are holding the literal creator of the universe in your hands and your senses are actively deceiving you, you can't just casually eat it and go home.
No, definitely not.
That immense psychological weight inevitably forces the ritual to change over the centuries. I mean, we see human behavior shift massively, moving from a secret communal meal to building giant gold boxes and holding literal parades.
Yeah, the behavioral shift traces a really fascinating historical arc. In the days of the early church, the focus was heavily on the communal meal and the practical necessity of taking the sacrament to the sick.
Like people hiding out in the catacombs.
Exactly. Our historical sources highlight stories from the early days, like St. Tarsicius. He was a young early Christian who literally gave his life, allowing himself to be beaten to death by a mob, rather than surrender the Blessed Sacrament he was smuggling to prisoners.
Wow, that's intense devotion.
It really is. You also see early monastic hermits keeping the sacrament in their solitary desert cells just to maintain a constant physical proximity to the divine. But the tipping point into mass cultural adoration, where it becomes a giant public spectacle, that happens a bit later.
Right, there's a massive controversy in the 11th century that acts as a catalyst. Let's talk about that.
So an 11th century French archdeacon named Berengar of Tours publicly challenged the idea that the bread and wine materially changed into Christ. He argued for a more spiritual presence.
And I'm guessing that didn't go over well.
It caused an absolute uproar in the theological world. In response, Pope Gregory VII came down with the full weight of the papacy, heavily reaffirming the absolute physical, real presence of Christ in the elements.
So they double down.
They absolutely double down. Once that controversy was settled, the church didn't just maintain the status quo. They leaned into the physical adoration of the Eucharist harder than ever before.
And the sources are just packed with vivid historical details of this explosion in devotion. By the 13th century, Pope Urban V institutes an entirely new holiday, right? The Feast of Corpus Christi, the Feast of the Body of Christ.
Yes. And he even commissions Thomas Aquinas himself to write the hymns for the processions.
Which is wild. And then you have stories like King Louis VII of France. In 1226, he wins a military victory against a group deemed heretics. And to celebrate, he asks the local bishop to expose the sacrament for public adoration.
Just as a one-time celebration, originally.
Right, but the emotional response from the public was so overwhelming that the bishop just left it out. This started a practice of uninterrupted day and night adoration in Avignon that lasted from 1226 all the way until the French Revolution in 1792.
Over 500 years. Uninterrupted.
It's staggering.
Try to picture the sensory reality of that for an everyday person. Imagine being a 14th century peasant. Your daily life is defined by dirt, disease, and back-breaking labor.
Sounds miserable.
It was. But you walk into this massive stone cathedral filled with the smell of heavy incense echoing with Latin chants. And sitting on the altar is a massive glowing golden vessel called a monstrance, shaped like a sunburst. And right in the center, behind glass, is the host.
And to them, that's not just a nice symbol.
No, for that peasant, this wasn't just a symbol of hope. It was the literal king of the universe holding court in their neighborhood.
But logically, wait. If the Eucharist was originally instituted at the Last Supper by Jesus as a meal, something inherently meant to be eaten, how does the theology justify turning it into an object that people just stared at for centuries?
The Catholic justification hinges entirely on the permanence of the change. If that piece of bread has fundamentally become the creator, then adoring it isn't just staring at bread. It is believed to be the abiding presence of Christ.
So it's like a sneak peek of heaven.
Exactly. Our Catholic sources frame it as a foretaste of heaven, pointing to the book of Revelation, which describes multitudes of angels and saints worshiping the Lamb on the throne in the heavenly Jerusalem. For the medieval mind, adoring the host on earth was mirroring that exact same heavenly worship.
The king is on his throne in heaven, but he is also simultaneously residing in the local tabernacle.
Right.
Now, to the modern mind, staring at a wafer seems almost incomprehensible. But the medieval scholars didn't just stare and call it a mystery. They built an intricate philosophical engine to explain the actual physics of the miracle. They needed to explain how this was happening.
Yes, they adopted the term transubstantiation. It was first used in the 11th century by Hildebert de Leeuwarden and officially locked into church dogma at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215.
Transubstantiation. It's quite a mouthful.
It is. And to understand how it works, you really have to understand the dominant lens of medieval science and reality, which was the philosophy of Aristotle. In the Aristotelian framework, everything in the universe is divided into two categories: substance and accidents.
Okay, we definitely need to ground those terms. How did Aristotle define substance and accidents?
So the substance is the fundamental whatness of a thing. It is the invisible, essential reality that makes a thing exactly what it is. The accidents are the physical, outward properties that your senses can perceive: the weight, the color, the taste, the smell, the shape.
Okay.
So the doctrine of transubstantiation claims that the substance of the bread and wine completely changes into the body and blood of Christ, while every single one of the accidents of bread and wine remain perfectly intact and unchanged.
Let me test an analogy here. So it's like taking a wooden chair, and through a miracle, the fundamental invisible reality of that chair becomes a living dog.
Okay, I see where you're going.
But to the naked eye, it still looks, feels, and functions exactly like a wooden chair. It feels like wood. You can sit on it. It splinters. But fundamentally, invisibly, it is a dog. Does that track?
That gets you halfway there, but we have to push that analogy further to see how extreme the claim really is. It doesn't just look like a chair. The universe still treats it mathematically and physically as a chair.
What do you mean?
Well, if you set that miraculous chair on fire, it will produce wood ash, not bone ash. If you eat the Eucharistic bread, it will biologically nourish you like bread, and eventually it will physically corrupt like bread. The dog reality, or the Christ reality, is purely metaphysical.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the physical properties are operating entirely independently of their new substance.
But wait, didn't Aristotle explicitly argue that a thing's substance and its accidents are a package deal? You can't have the physical properties of a chair floating around in the universe without the underlying substance of a chair anchoring them.
He absolutely did.
So isn't the church breaking the very philosophical rules it's trying to borrow to explain the miracle?
This raises an important question, and honestly, Thomas Aquinas was well aware of this. Aquinas admitted that transubstantiation completely inverts Aristotle.
He just admitted it.
Yep. In nature, accidents cannot exist without their proper substance. But Aquinas argued that the Eucharist is not a natural change. It is an entirely supernatural exception affected by God's power alone.
So God is just manually keeping the properties of bread going.
Right. God miraculously sustains the physical properties of bread and wine, keeping them in existence, even though their original substance has been completely obliterated and replaced.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this exact, highly technical philosophical rule breaking becomes the spark that ignites a massive theological revolution. When the 16th century rolls around, the reformers look at this Aristotelian inversion and just completely reject it.
And that rejection is what fundamentally shatters Western Christianity. The Davenant Institute source paints an incredibly dramatic picture of the stakes involved here. This wasn't just a polite academic disagreement.
No, people died over this.
A prime example is Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. The source describes how he is escorted to the pulpit of St. Mary's in Oxford. The reigning monarch, Queen Mary Tudor, fully expects him to publicly recant his Protestant faith and submit to Catholic teaching.
Which would have saved his life.
Exactly. Instead, Cranmer uses his final moments to completely denounce what he calls papistical doctrines, specifically calling out the Catholic teaching on the sacrament.
He knew exactly what that would mean for him.
He did. The resulting pandemonium ends with Cranmer being dragged from the pulpit, taken to the stake, and burned alive.
The political tension of the time made this a literal matter of treason and heresy, a difference worth dying for. But we need to clarify a massive historical misconception about what Cranmer and the other reformers were actually dying for. People often assume the debate was simple, like Catholics believed Christ was in the Eucharist and Protestants believed it was just a completely empty, meaningless symbol.
That is profoundly incorrect, and it misses the entire theological nuance of the era. The primary bitter debate between the Reformers and the Catholic Church was not about whether Christ was present. The debate was about whether the bread and wine were still present.
Wait, really?
Yes, the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation mandated that the bread was gone. It had been obliterated to make room for Christ. The Protestants insisted that the bread fundamentally remained.
Martin Luther was absolutely furious about the philosophical gymnastics used to justify getting rid of the bread. He called transubstantiation a monstrous word for a monstrous idea and dismissed it entirely as a pseudo-philosophy of Aristotle.
He did not mince words.
No, he didn't. Luther's argument was essentially, why do we need this ridiculous Aristotelian magic trick to believe Jesus is present? Why can't Jesus just be present with the bread? And then John Calvin comes in and focuses heavily on the practical application of the sacrament.
Right, Calvin has that famous quote.
Yeah, he famously declared that as long as Christ remains outside of us, whatever he has suffered and done remains useless.
That quote points directly to the mechanics of how grace operates in the Protestant framework. Grace, in this historical context, isn't just a vague feeling of goodwill. It was understood as a divine life force, a spiritual medicine absolutely necessary for salvation.
Okay, so how did they think it was delivered?
Well, for the Reformers, the Catholic doctrine had artificially separated nature from grace. The Catholic views seemed to imply that for God's grace to be fully present, the natural world, the bread had to be wiped out of existence.
So the Reformers disagreed with that.
Very much so.
Yeah.
The Reformers believed that God used ordinary, unbroken natural creatures like bread and wine as instruments to deliver that grace. God doesn't need to obliterate physical reality to work through it.
It's a fundamental shift from viewing the sacrament as a static object
Mm-hmm.
to viewing it as a dynamic action. Like, think of a binding contract. A contract printed on paper is just a piece of paper. It has no power on its own. The power, the reality of the agreement, only happens in the action of signing it and executing the deal. You don't put the unsigned paper in a golden box and worship it. The action itself, it's the point.
That's a great way to look at it.
And the Italian reformer Peter Martyr Vermigli pointed out something similar.
Mm-hmm.
He said Christians don't treat the water of baptism the way Catholics treat the bread of the Eucharist. No one thinks the baptismal water is permanently transformed into the Creator. The water is an instrument used in a holy action.
And that shift from object to action completely revolutionized the lived experience of the average person. Think about how radically Sunday morning changed.
Oh, yeah, it would be entirely different.
For centuries, the laity stood in the back of a dark church, watching a priest far away on the altar hold up a golden box while speaking Latin, a language they didn't understand. The focus was entirely on the consecration by the priest. But with the Reformation, the focus shifted entirely to the reception by the believer.
So they were suddenly active participants.
Exactly. The laity were now standing around a table, hearing the words of institution in their native tongue, and actively eating the bread and drinking the wine themselves. If the bread just sits on the altar, it does nothing. The grace is transmitted in the faithful eating of it.
We've covered an incredible expanse of human history and thought today. We've traced early Christians hiding in catacombs, risking their lives to smuggle a piece of bread to prisoners.
We really have.
We've seen medieval philosophers stretch the limits of Aristotelian logic to explain a miracle, and reformers burning at the stake over the precise definition of what is left in the cup.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this millennia-old debate isn't just about ancient theology. It's fundamentally about how humanity attempts to bridge the vast, seemingly uncrossable gap between the material world we live in and the divine realm we reach for.
The core tension that sparked all of this remains.
Right. Does God fundamentally alter and override physical reality to reach us, demanding our absolute sense-defying submission? Or does he use the ordinary, unbroken things of this earth as gentle vehicles for grace?
So, what does this all mean for you? The way these historical figures understood a simple piece of bread reflected their deepest assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Our goal today was to show you the architecture behind those beliefs.
Exactly.
Whether you fall on the side of literal transformation, spiritual metaphor, or secular observation, the intensity of this debate forces us to look at the world differently. I mean, think about it. If the most profound, universe-altering divine presence was historically believed to be perfectly hidden inside the most mundane, ordinary objects, a scrap of bread and a sip of wine, what else in your everyday, ordinary life might be masking something infinitely profound, just waiting for the right kind of attention to be recognized?